Good evening and welcome to the News Project Live, a weekly conversation with industry leaders about the current state of the news business and where it's heading. Our hosts are Merrill Brown, CEO of the News Project, and Alex Leo, Head of Audience for the News Project. We are live on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Immediately after the broadcast, our show is available on demand on any of these social platforms, where you can also find our previous episodes. Without further ado, Merrill Brown.
Good evening from New York City. I'm Merrill Brown of the News Project, and welcome to tonight's year-end edition of the News Project Live. Thanks for joining us. We're a little dressed up tonight because this is our holiday episode after all, and it's as close to a holiday party as I'm going to get. So I thought we'd dress up, wear our white shirt and red tie, and enjoy the festive season. On this, our 16th episode of the year, co-host Alex, Leo, and I are pleased to bring you one of the most widely watched, respected, and talked about reporters of the election season. We welcome tonight NBC News and MSNBC Political Correspondent Steve Kornacki. We thank you for tuning in and for your support over 2020. We launched the program with a goal of spurring conversation about the news industry, focusing on the issues that make the world of running news organizations so challenging. Our audiences for a single program have ranged as high as 12,000, and we're appreciative that you've tuned in. Please let your friends know about tonight's program and remind them that each of these episodes are available immediately on demand on YouTube and on the other social channels. Tonight, we look at what many of us have been living through this fall, an election as intense as any, in which television news reminded us of its vitality, even in this era of digital disruption. There's been a level of engagement rarely seen in American politics and a record number of voters. Stuck at home, we're consuming media all the time, and at no time more intently than during the Electoral College controversies, ending in an election called 5 days after an election day, captivating the country. And today, even 6 weeks later, the incumbent, President Trump, is yet to concede. Through that election period, few people got more attention for their coverage than Steve Kornacki. A conversation with Steve about that coverage and what's ahead is coming right up. At our company, The News Project, we're working to build technology and services to help small and medium-sized news organizations get ahead. Our work has ranged from the recently relaunched Brooklyn Magazine to the arts and culture site Black Book to a newspaper in Montana and one of California's most influential news outlets. Our goal is to help them produce great products and seek sustainable models. More on our work later when Alex and I debrief on TNP. Tonight, Alex joins us from her home in Washington, D.C. Alex, welcome.
Welcome, everyone. Happy Hanukkah, happy final night of Hanukkah, and Merry Christmas, and happy Kwanzaa, happy any holiday you celebrate. Please send us your questions. Tell us where you're watching from. We want to hear from you and have Steve interact with you. So let us know who you are, where you are, and what you want to know. Merrill?
Thanks to Alex. The challenge of making sense of the Electoral College minute by minute has become a Steve Kornacki trademark. He's good at data, he presents it clearly and with verve, and he's also an outstanding reporter. A native of Groton, Massachusetts, and a graduate of Boston University, Steve covered New Jersey politics, became political editor, and did outstanding work at Salon, where I first got to know Steve and his work. He began at MSNBC in 2012 and has done hosting, was a substitute host for Hardball, has produced podcasts, and over the last couple of weeks has even been working on NBC's Sunday Night Football broadcast doing, guess what? Standing nimbly in front of a big board reviewing NFL postseason prospects. His work ethic and stamina, including 2 days straight after Election Day, supplemented primarily by Diet Coke, his now widely discussed khakis, and one of his several nicknames, Chart Throb, are the stuff of media chatter. But Steve is also a gifted journalist and a wise student of politics, which he's been focused on since his childhood. And of course, it's not over yet, as Steve will be devoting his prodigious energy over the coming 3 weeks on control of the Senate and the 2 Georgia Senate races. And presumably on election night, January 5th, he'll be at another big board one last time in this long election season. Steve, welcome to the News Project Live. We're pleased to have you. We hope you're safe and comfortable in New York, as New York has faced a snowstorm and, of course, a resurgent coronavirus. Good evening, Steve.
Good evening. Thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here, and I know you can see my window a little bit in the background, so maybe you can see some of the snow from that storm piling up outside there.
Right. Thanks, Steve. Let's dive right in. You know, as I was just saying, and as you said often, it's been an extraordinary 6 weeks since Election Day. What do you take away from the length of this whole process, the Trump challenges, and the media's handling of the story?
Yeah, it's put the media, I think, in an unusual position. In recent memory, we had a presidential election that was, contested for weeks after Election Day. That was back in 2000, of course, Bush versus Gore, the Florida recount. And of course, Florida ended up being settled when the Supreme Court weighed in December of 2000. So in a sense, we've been here before, but I think the big difference between then and now is what was being contested in Florida was a very, very narrow presidential race. The official margin 20 years ago, 537 votes. That made the difference in the presidency. 537 votes in Florida. Florida goes for Bush. Bush gets 271 electoral votes. So the stakes were incredibly high, and literally every ballot mattered there in terms of being challenged. This was different. This was different because this was about states where the president had lost. Pennsylvania, for instance, by 80,000 votes. A state like Michigan, where the margin was well over 100,000. Even a state like Georgia, where it was relatively speaking tight, you're still talking about 12,000 vote margin right there. So this was very different, I think, from 2000, and I think this required, certainly from my standpoint, the way I could speak to it. I thought the challenge was, if the president and his team want to try to present something in court about Michigan, Pennsylvania, wherever, they absolutely have the right to do that. The burden is on them in that process to produce the kind of evidence that would change the result. Always be asking the question: have they produced any new evidence today? Did they produce any evidence in a court of law that would cast doubt on this election? And also, I think, just to be mindful of what the various mechanical steps are that are in place between Election Day and Inauguration Day, and just check those off as they come and go. For instance, just this week we had the meeting of the Electoral College. That's a big one, for all of the noise, for all of the bluster of the last month or so. The Electoral College met as scheduled. The votes that were cast were exactly in line with what happened in the election. There wasn't a single faithless elector. And so for all of the noise and all of the bluster for the last month, nothing has come out of a court to change this. Nothing came out of the Electoral College meetings to change this. And now the last step in this process before the inauguration is just the formal acceptance of those Electoral College votes by Congress in January. And, we'll cover that as well.
Steve, we talk a lot on this program and at our company about media disruption and change. And yet, good old-fashioned television has brought us together over this election season when we're all at home and so many of us have been watching. That puts an enormous pressure on you and on your colleagues. What have those pressures meant for you, for the coverage, and for your team?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. You talk about the role of television. I think television, in some ways, you're always talking about the audience being so splintered these days, and then streaming and online and all these different disruptions, the word you use there. But I think still, when you come to something like an election, a presidential election, live broadcast, cable news, live television can be the most efficient way to track it and to know what's going on minute to minute. And so I was aware of that from long before we came on the air, but certainly from the minute we came on the air at 6 o'clock on election night. I felt my duty was to try to essentially be the play-by-play announcer for the election returns as they came in, and to try to take viewers, I should say, through, here's what we've got from this state. Keep in mind, here's what we don't have yet. Keep in mind, here are the various variables that are suddenly in place in this election because of COVID, mail-in voting, things like this. Not to get ahead of myself, not to be speculating and guessing myself, but just to be presenting at any given moment. I thought my job was to present the range of possible outcomes, the range of possible next steps at any given moment. Never to get ahead of that, and to always present as complete a picture as possible. And I viewed that as my job, and it ended up taking about 4.5 days to get that done.
Amazing. I want to say hi to some of our viewers. Emily, who's watching on LinkedIn, says, I've been a huge Steve fan for years. So happy for his recent success. Hi, Rhonda, watching from St. Petersburg, Florida on Facebook, and Steve Delphin, watching from Washington, D.C. So, Steve, one of the most consequential calls of the night from a decision desk was Fox News calling Arizona for Biden. Can you review for us the dynamic around that call and how MSNBC, NBC responded?
Yeah, so to put this in context, Arizona is one of those states where when the poll, well, first of all, Arizona is a very interesting state because when the polls close in Arizona, they have to wait an hour before they can release any results. But when they release those first results late at night, East Coast time, in any election in Arizona, you generally get about 75% of all of the votes that were cast are reported out all at once. So it's usually about 11:10 Eastern time. You will suddenly go from 0 to 75% of the vote reported out in Arizona. That's because they have extensive mail-in voting, extensive early voting, and they are allowed to process these ballots ahead of time. So they're able to get it all counted up, and it's just a question of releasing it. So we knew that first batch that came out at 11 o'clock, a little bit after 11, was going to be favorable to Joe Biden. We knew that the subsequent ballots, the other 25% that would take a couple of days for the officials to get through, were going to be more Trump favorable. Mm-hmm. It was sort of a question, I think, in where were the expectations? How high did Biden need to have? How big did Biden need to have a lead in that initial batch, where Trump couldn't realistically offset it in the subsequent votes, in the remaining quarter or so of the votes that would come in? And the other variable in this was the exit poll. And I think this is the key element when you try to understand why Fox called this. Because remember, it wasn't just Fox that called it.
Right.
The Associated Press as well. And there was, in the wake of 2016, media organizations up until that point had traditionally kind of all come together as a consortium, and there was an exit poll for the media. There was a split after 2016, and the Associated Press with Fox went off and they did their own thing. And NBC News and most of the other sort of traditional major national outlets stuck with it's Edison Research is the provider, but we stuck with the sort of the provider we had been using. So suddenly you had two different exit polls in 2020. That was a new element. And I don't think it's any coincidence that Fox and the Associated Press were the two to call it on election night, while NBC and all of the others who were using the same exit poll we were refrained from calling it, because I think our exit poll data was suggesting that, let's see, there still may be room here for Trump to come back and pull this thing out. We need to see some more votes here. I think that's what our decision desk was saying, and the other decision desks for that matter. And I think the exit poll data looked a little bit different for the AP and Fox. Look, ultimately, their call was validated in that Biden won the state, but that margin came all the way down. That Trump margin, that Biden margin came all the way down to 10,000 votes before it was all said and done. So, my takeaway is I end up being, I'm happy with the decision NBC made and other networks made not to make the call that night, because I think, when it can come all the way down to 10,000, you can't be sure on election night it's not going to come down further.
Okay, that makes sense. We have a follow-up question, Steve, but before that, I want to say hi to some other viewers. Tammy, she says she's really enjoy the Steve interaction with Rachel Maddow in the late earlies. And Jackie Leo, my mother, says Kornacki is an honest broker. He respects the data and he knows how to analyze it without tainting it towards one party or another. So Steve, tell us a little bit about how you work with the decision desk and if that's representative of how most news organizations do it.
Yeah, I mean, the decision desk is the College of Cardinals of election night. And a lot of this, decision desks have existed at major television networks for a long time now. But I think a major moment in the evolution of the decision desk as an entity was that 2000 election I was talking about a few minutes ago. Because, of course, if you remember the 2000 election, initially that night, Florida was called for Gore. Then the call was pulled back. Then it was called for Bush. Then the call was pulled back. And then the long recount ensued. And there was a lot of soul searching among television networks after the 2000 election. Television executives were called before Congress after the 2000 election, promised reforms, promised there wouldn't be a debacle like 2000 again. And I think one of the things that grew out of that was, when I say the College of Cardinals, what I'm implying there is they are separated, intentionally walled off. The decision desk is from people like me. They this year it was a little different because of the pandemic, so a lot of this was virtual. But in a normal election, they sit in their own room. If anybody like me, anybody from the editorial side is going to go in there and talk with them, if you have a question, you can go in there and talk to them. But there's somebody with security is there to escort you in, to stand with you while you have a conversation. And the idea is that there is no interference in their making decisions, in their making calls, in their assessment of when it is time to call the race, when it is too soon to call a race, and that when they make the decision, that's the network's call. That's going to be the NBC call. And so it's an interesting relationship because we can and we do talk to them. We'll say, hey, I'm seeing this right now. I'm thinking this means X. What are you seeing? We can have those kinds of conversations. But ultimately, this is very much the way it's designed to work. And I believe this is basically, how it goes at every other network. Ultimately, that decision, when it was 11:30 in the morning, Saturday morning, and Pennsylvania was called, that was the decision desk's call to do that.
Steve, tell us about the dynamic and how it was that you stayed there so long, what the process was of thinking through things as you got to Wednesday and then Thursday, and what did all that look like and feel like, and what was the analysis?
It was it was an interesting week. I went into the night there was a range of possibilities in my mind for how this was going to go and for how long this was going to take that ranged from a couple of hours. There was a scenario in my mind going into this that we knew Florida is very good at getting its vote counted. They're very efficient. You can get all of the results from Florida by like 11 p.m. on election night. So we knew we were going to have Florida. And we knew that, look, if Joe Biden wins Florida, there's no realistic path for Donald Trump in the Electoral College. So it seemed possible to me, certainly going into election night, that Joe Biden's just going to win Florida. And we'll know that at 10, 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. And, while we wouldn't call the election officially, the conversation at that point would shift immediately to, sort of, we know Biden's got this. And I think that my role would have been very different in a world like that. So on the one hand, I was ready for a scenario like that. On the other hand, there was a scenario that drags on days or weeks. And that is what we started to get into. And it became, some of the key moments for me were, number one was about 5 a.m., the Wednesday morning after the election, Tuesday night into Wednesday morning at 5 a.m. I stayed up all night on the air because I knew we were going to get a big batch of votes from the city of Milwaukee in Wisconsin, the mail-in votes from Milwaukee, and they were going to come out sometime overnight. And this was going to decide Wisconsin because Donald Trump led in Wisconsin late into the night, well into the early morning hours. And it certainly seemed plausible to me that there might not be enough votes in Milwaukee to get Joe Biden over the top. And if Trump gets Wisconsin, this is getting real serious in terms of, hey, Trump could really win this thing. So the one big one for me was that moment at 5 a.m. Do the Democrats get the votes they need there out of Milwaukee or not? They did. Biden overtook Trump. He ends up winning the state by 20,000 votes. And I knew at that point, okay, we're shifting to Pennsylvania. It's going to come down to Pennsylvania. And there, it just became a question of the thing we needed to understand about Pennsylvania was they couldn't process the mail-in ballots until the election was over, until the polls closed on election night. You had county clerks, you had city clerks getting deluged with mail-in ballots for weeks before election day, hundreds of thousands of them piling up. They couldn't touch them until the polls closed. So we knew that was going to build some lag time in. And, different counties started releasing them Wednesday, Thursday at different times. We wanted to get a sense of what's the pace here. We know Biden's going to win the majority of these. How big is that majority? We needed to establish what the pace was because, look, if he could get about 65% of them, he was going to pass Donald Trump statewide. If he couldn't, he wouldn't. And sometime I would say Thursday, it became clear the pace really was going to be statewide about 76%. Biden was going to get 76% of the mail-in votes. And in my mind, from that point forward, Thursday night into Friday, Saturday morning, it really was just a question of time. It was just a question of when enough counties in Pennsylvania would get their mail-in votes tallied up, released. Biden would catch Trump, would build a pad in Pennsylvania. And then, as you saw that 11:30 a.m., on Saturday morning, the decision desk would say, okay, it's reached a big enough level, we will call it now.
And yet, Steve, that very dynamic about the early Trump lead and then the enormous number of votes coming in for Biden has become a theme of the people who are raising questions about the election. And as much as you might be deft at explaining it here and on TV, there is enormous misinformation among, I think it's fair to say, tens of millions of people about that sequence of events. How did that happen, and what can we do about that?
Yeah, no, and look, my approach to this was to just, I'm there to sort of go through the process with folks. So let's explain it. I was, my goal on the air months before the election was to suggest this was likely to happen in Pennsylvania and some other states, that, basically they had never done mail-in voting before. So a state like Pennsylvania had absentee voting. You could say, hey, look, I'm sick, I can't vote, I'm going to be out of the country on work, I can't vote in person on election day. You could get a ballot, and there might be, any given county might have 100 of these, a couple hundred of them, something like that. And so the state law, in Pennsylvania was, well, okay, these absentee ballots, these, few dozen, few hundred you might have in any given county, you gotta wait till polls are closed, then you can open them up. And it was no big deal because it would take them an hour to do it. And then the pandemic comes along, and Pennsylvania says, okay, look, we got to allow folks a chance to vote by mail here. Mail-in voting, no excuse. If you want an absentee ballot by mail, you can get it. So they changed that part of it. There was a whole impasse there in the state capitol. They did not change the state law that said all of these absentee ballots, these mail absentee ballots that come in, you can't open them until the polls close on election night. And so we saw that coming. We saw that coming months out. And when it became clear by October that they were not gonna reach some kind of a deal in the state legislature with the governor to get that changed. We saw that coming, that there was going to be a massive pileup, that it was going to take days. And the other thing that was clear in the polling, I know the polling was wrong in a lot of ways, but this was clear in the polling, was that the issue of mail-in voting had become so polarized on party lines because of Trump was out there bashing mail-in voting. Democrats were out there saying, let's do it, let's do it, let's do it. We had polling consistently in Pennsylvania showing that folks who were voting by mail, intended to vote by mail, Biden was getting 75, 80% of them. So we knew that piece of it too. We knew that mail-in vote was going to be heavily Democratic. We weren't sure how heavy. That was the question. But my job on the air, I just saw was, look, a version of what I just told you, say that on the air over and over before the election as much as we can. Say that on the air on election night before we get any votes from Pennsylvania, and keep saying that on the air as those votes come in, that this process, you may be watching this unfold right now on the air and say, this is very flawed. It should not take 4 days to get these votes counted. You may very well be right about that, but that is the process that was on the books for Pennsylvania. And it is, based on that process, supposed to look like this.
So that's obviously that's obviously an important topic coming out of the election. Are there any lessons for your news organization or for newsrooms in general from that experience? What did NBC and MSNBC and Steve Kornacki learn? Yeah,
I think here's the question, and I think it's an interesting area of coverage for the next couple years, is how much of what was changed in terms of the mechanics of elections in various states around the country, how much of that is going to become permanent now? I think we need to have a sense of that. And what are, I think there are some real voting reform questions that were raised by this election. The simplest one is the one I just took you through. If you're going to have universal or universally available mail-in voting in a state, are you going to change the law in that state to allow a swift processing of those votes? Other issues, though, I think that have been raised about election mechanics through this election are, if you're going to have widespread mail voting, or if you're going to allow for, as a lot of states do, widespread early voting. That's where you still go to a polling place physically, but you can do it a week ahead of time, a month ahead of time in some states. How long should that window be? How long before election day should that window be? Should it really be a month ahead of time? Should it be 3 weeks ahead of time? Should it be, while there are still presidential debates to be held, should people be casting their ballots? I think that's a valid question. And then if you're going to raise a question about, well, hey, maybe the early voting, maybe the mail-in voting window has become too broad, maybe it needs to be narrowed. What about the actual election day itself? Is there a justification to expand that, to say, hey, maybe we don't need election day, maybe we need election weekend. Maybe you need to provide more opportunities for folks to be going to the polls to vote in person, just given the complexities of modern life. So to me, the challenge for news organizations going forward, I think, is to explore these issues, to raise these questions. And I think, it's not so much to raise the questions too. I say to raise the questions, they are going to be raised. You're going to see movements, I think, in various states around the country to make some of the changes that I'm describing here. And I think that should be a major piece of emphasis in our coverage for the next couple of years, because what those midterm elections look like in 2022, what the presidential election looks like in 2024, if we go through the kinds of things we went through this year, that's going to be decided, in the next 18 months or so, just in one state capital after another.
Thanks so much for that, Steve. Merrill, speaking of news organizations and how they can improve, can you tell our audience a little bit about TNP?
Thanks, Alex. So we do a lot of things at the News Project. Fundamentally, we're a news platform, and we provide technology and a place for people to put their news, entrepreneurs, small publishing companies, news sites around communities. We provide people with audience development services, which is among the many things that Alex does. We give them a business development help. Here you see a list of the services we offer. Basically, we call ourselves news business in a box, because everything one needs, an organization, an NGO, a group of entrepreneurs or journalists, what you need to operate a news site efficiently in your community or around an important topic, we offer at the News Project. And please be in touch with us about it. We're happy to take your questions, email or otherwise. We'd love to hear from you about our work. You can write me, Merrill, at thenewsproject.net, or you can write Alex, whose address is alex@thenewsproject.net. Thank you. Alex?
Thanks, Merrill. I want to say hi to some of our viewers at home. Larry Kramer watching on YouTube, Linda Bernstein watching on Facebook. Thanks all for joining us. And we have a question from our loyal watcher, Aparna. She asks, Steve, how do you think we can better represent sentiment, tenor of anger, and more in polling and forecasting? And do you think that's, I'm adding on here, but do you think that's part of what's off in the polling in general?
Well, yeah, polling, I think, is another one of those issues that comes out of this election that are just in terms of decisions that media organizations have to make and conversations that have to take place. Because I think there's, there were problems in polling in 2020. And I think what concerns me the most is they really were the same problems we saw in 2016 in a lot of ways. And they were the same problems that we saw in 2018 in a lot of ways. We didn't talk much about it in 2018, but it was still there. The problem is a certain demographic, I think, was missed in the polling. And there's a whole debate about why the demographic was missed, how the demographic was missed. But it was a Trump-friendly demographic. You would define it as, I think, blue-collar white voters without a college degree, older white voters, rural white voters, some combination of this, and particularly, maybe even exclusively, in the northern tier of the country. So, for instance, I think the swing state that had the biggest polling miss was Wisconsin. Mm-hmm. Joe Biden's average lead in the polling in Wisconsin was, 8 or 9 points going into election day. And as we just said, he wins it by 20,000 votes. He wins it by a fraction of a point. That was your biggest single miss. But the polls were off in Ohio. They were off in Iowa. They were off in Michigan, even in Pennsylvania. The polls missed in states like that again, just as they did in 2016. And again, I say even in the 2018 midterms, we didn't talk about it much because the story was Democrats taking over the House, and the Democrats did very well in suburbs across the country. That was the big takeaway from 2018. But in the states like I'm describing, there were still problems. There was still a problem with polling in 2018. So, I think what concerns me is after 2016, we said, hey, problem with state polling, problem in places like Wisconsin, problem in places like Michigan and Pennsylvania. Look, there was much more frequent polling in 2020 than there was in 2016 in these states. And again, still, it wasn't for lack of polling that there was a miss like in Wisconsin that I'm describing here. Also, there were all sorts of mechanical steps that were taken by pollsters. I think if you follow this conversation closely, you're probably familiar with the term weighting by education. You know, again, I'm talking about it's white voters without a college degree that have kind of been missed in the polling. That was one of the mechanical steps that pollsters kind of embraced post 2016 that was supposed to account for that. Didn't get it done in 2020. So look, I think, you know, the question to me of, you know, is this an existential issue for polling? Because if polling can't reliably capture the demographic I'm describing, its value greatly diminishes. Or, you know, is this something that can be corrected? Or the other possibility here, I think, is, you know, is this something that is kind of tied in some way to the Trump era? This is, again, these are Trump-friendly voters, folks he got huge margins with, folks who turned out in numbers that weren't expected in 2016 and again in 2020. Is it something specific about Trump-era polarization that has caused this problem in polling? And in a post-Trump world, does that problem correct itself? I think that's a possibility too. But I think, look, given the reliance of folks like me on polling, we got to think about that a lot.
We have a question from the aforementioned Larry Kramer, who perhaps you know of, Steve. He's a great journalist and was the publisher of USA Today. He, like a lot of people, wants to know how we can build back an environment where we have a shared set of facts, people of different opinions agreeing on the same facts and trusting the same news sources. Can we get back to that? And if so, how?
Boy, I hope so. I'd love to see that, you know, and I think that's one of the, you know, just the evolution to me. What scares me, I guess, on this front is I wrote a book a couple years ago. This is not meant to plug the book, but it was the theme of the book was the red-blue divide, trying to explore the origins of the red-blue, red states, blue states. And what occurred to me in putting that together was that, you know, we're talking about polarization. We're really talking about tribalism here. And I think there is something innate in human beings that makes us want to think tribally, that makes us want to be tribal, even if we don't fully recognize it. I think it manifests in our behavior. We have a tribal instinct, and it goes way back, and it's in us from our birth, and it's there. And what occurred to me in writing the book was the evolution of our media over the last 40 to 50 years, the nationalization of it, the rise of the internet, the rise of social media, the personalization of media, where you can just, you know, take out your phone, check Twitter, here's 16 media personalities or whatever who you follow, who all kind of agree with you, all reinforcing why you agree with them. I think all of that has been extremely conducive to that tribal instinct. And so I think it's just created this cycle where media has evolved in a way that feeds the tribal instinct, that it empowers this evolution in media, and that in many ways kind of speeds it up. And, you know, I would talk about this at book events, and of course it would raise the question, well, all right, how do we get out of it? And I hate to say it, I never came up with a great answer for it, except that I just said, do we get to a point where we are just all exhausted by it, where we're just all sick to death of it, where we're just all sick to death of being this way? And then human beings being endlessly creative, we find a way out of it. But I don't have a great answer for what that way is.
Steve, I want to say hi to some of our viewers who have joined us. Patricia, watching from White Post, Virginia. Natasha, who says, Steve's deservedly seated, wearing khakis, no doubt. Thank you for good, honest work. And lastly, to Lambert, who is watching on LinkedIn and says, great guest today. Please remember to send us your questions and tell us where you're watching from. Merrill?
Steve, you've become, you know, quite obviously an expert about the Electoral College. Your explanatory reporting on it is enormously valuable. But what do you really think of it and how we elect presidents? Could we be doing this in a better way?
Well, so yeah, it's interesting. This is I see both sides of this debate very clearly. I mean, look, on the one hand, you know, if you're a Democrat, you're looking at in 2000, your candidate got more votes than the Republican became president thanks to the Electoral College. 2016, your candidate Hillary Clinton got nearly 3 million more votes than Donald Trump. Donald Trump becomes president. And even this year, it didn't happen. But this year, think about this. That margin in the national popular vote for Joe Biden was about 4.5 points, right? It was about 2 for Hillary Clinton in 2016. It more than doubles in 2020. Biden was the national popular vote by 4.5, by more than 7 million votes. And yet, if you just switched 42,000 votes in Wisconsin, in Georgia, and in Arizona, a combined switch of 42,000 votes in those 3 states, Donald Trump, I think, would have been reelected. It would have been 269 in the Electoral College. I think the House, just the way it works in the House, it's controlled by Democrats, but in a 269 tie, each state in the House gets 1 vote, and there are going to be more Republican-controlled state delegations in the House. I think Trump came 42,000 votes from being reelected, even as he fell more than 7 million votes short in the national popular vote. So we were very, very close, I believe, to the biggest disconnect we have yet seen between the popular vote and the Electoral College. So I certainly understand. I understand the argument for changing that. Just, hey, most votes should win the presidential election. It shouldn't keep happening this way. I understand the argument against it. Some of the arguments against it about, we are a country of states. We're a collection of states. It's not always, it's not always going to be. It looks right now like this is a process that that gives the Republicans a massive built-in advantage. But these things change. They can change very quickly. You could go back to 2004, where John Kerry, lost by about 3 million votes nationally to George W. Bush, but came within about 100,000 in Ohio of getting elected president anyway. Democrats have come close to pulling this off before. Our politics can certainly change in a way where this advantage doesn't exist anymore. But look, it's a conversation that's hot right now, but I don't think anything changes on it because to change it, you need buy-in. This is in the Constitution. You need buy-in from both parties. And I don't think you're going to get buy-in from both parties unless they each feel they have something to gain by it. And they each feel they have something to lose by sticking with the current system. And just given that this has helped Republicans so clearly in the last 20 years and not helped Democrats, I don't see any change on that in the immediate horizon.
Steve, people take different things away from the election. What do you take away about your own journalism and where you want to take it? Is there another book coming? Do you want to do documentaries about American politics? Where is this adventure taking you?
I guess we'll see. Obviously, I love doing elections. I love doing election nights. I want to keep doing that. You mentioned, January 5th in Georgia. We'll be there. We'll be ready to go for that. I'm looking forward to that. I am looking forward to hopefully doing many more in the future. I am fascinated by modern political history in particular. I would say sort of television age political history, if you want to try to put a time frame on it. I'm fascinated by it. You say documentaries. There's this movement now, I think, towards sort of serialized podcasts. I could imagine doing, looking at the modern era of political history. And there's just so many rich stories in there that I don't think have been aired and would be just perfect for, sort of a 30 for 30 style treatment or like a serialized podcast. I think the most underutilized resource we have here at NBC, I have access to it. It's the best part about this job. It's our archives. I have access at my desk right here to the NBC News archives. I am the kind of person who will decide, with 30 minutes to kill, I'm going to go watch an episode of the Today Show from 1980. And I'll tune in. There's Tom Brokaw. Let's see what he has to say today. So I'm just endlessly fascinated with sort of mass media era politics. And I'd love to bring some of those stories to life. I think we have great platforms now to do that exist now in media. And I just think, archives are not just NBC, but in general, newspaper archives, radio archives, internet archives. At this point, there are so many tools to tell these stories and to really bring them to life. And I'd love to find ways to do that.
Absolutely. We have a comment from Tammy, which leads into my next question. And Tammy says, my mother sent me to the Gap to buy Kornacki khakis vote for my brother for Christmas. They will be under the tree on December 25th. So Steve, You've had the national spotlight after the election with Leslie Jones tweeting about you endlessly, BuzzFeed writers jokingly claiming to be your husband, seemingly everyone obsessed with your pants. What has your reaction been to all this attention?
I mean, flattered but baffled, I guess is the way to put it. I mean, honestly, I think with the pants is you could chalk that up to a lack of adult supervision at 30 Rock, where I work. I mean, honestly, I just I wear them because they're comfortable enough. I've always kind of worn them, and with the pandemic, there's just not a lot of folks in the building, and so we got to the election, and I didn't really have anybody here to tell me, make sure you wear the dress pants here, and make sure to wear this fancy tie, and all. So I just kind of threw on what I would normally wear, threw a tie on too, and went on the air. And I think in the past I might have got in some trouble for that, and then it set all of this off. So go figure.
We have another question, and Merrill, this one involves you too. This is from Joshua Fenton. Merrill was very critical of the national media and its coverage during the 2016 campaign of Trump. Is the national media being diligent enough in its coverage of Biden now? Steve?
I would say too soon to tell. Let's see. But he's going to be, I think the challenge with Biden is going to be, based on the campaign, certainly. And I know the pandemic obviously, altered this campaign in ways we've never seen before, but he's going to be a very, very different kind of president than Trump. I don't think he's going to be a prolific tweeter. I don't think he's going to be provoking on Twitter at all the way Donald Trump did. I don't think he's going to be generally provoking. It's kind of rallies and all of the things you've seen with Trump, I think, that have created this Trump media dynamic, I don't think are going to be there. So I think the challenge for the media, though, is to apply scrutiny in ways that aren't so immediately public and immediately in the spotlight, the way a lot of Trump's behavior was. I think that's the challenge with Biden. And we're still more than a month to Inauguration Day. I know he's starting to fill the administration, but I do think we'll see on that.
Steve, you started out as a writer. The written word means a lot to you. You've written, books and articles, and have, newspaper and news site DNA in your bloodstream. What do you think about print and the future of the newspaper, and how does all that strike you?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me, I believe I saw news today about the Washington Post going on a hiring spree. It seems the New York Times comes to mind, the Washington Post. It's like there are a couple of newspapers that have become, say, the nationalization of media. A couple of national newspapers that have really been successful. And I think that the Trump presidency has had a ton to do with that. And it seems to me there's a future for a select few national newspapers that can still, social media certainly helps with this. The internet certainly helps with this. That can still kind of set the tone for the conversation in national politics and just sort of in national news in general. There are a couple of newspapers like the Times and the Post that seem to have survived and now have begun to thrive. But what dismays me is that level, the Newark Star Ledger, the Hartford Courant, that level, the Baltimore Sun, cities all across the country that used to have, not long ago, certainly, well within my lifetime, my adult lifetime, had vibrant, rich coverage of their cities, of their regions, of their areas. And I think you're missing that coverage. You're missing the voices that came through those pages. And I think you're creating an increasingly nationalized news product that people are absorbing pieces of, and that becomes the basis for sort of what our culture, what defines our culture, what our culture talks about, what it obsesses over. It's that bothers me greatly. We'll have a few newspapers that survive, but it seems like the voices that sort of drive those newspapers and drive that coverage are going to be increasingly concentrated in like a New York, or a DC or a place like that. And the other one though that I do think the other newspaper level that seems to have some future to me is that ultra local, the small town newspaper, where the obituaries still matter, the real local news that doesn't have like viral potency, but that you can only get by buying for $1 each week or whatever the town newspaper. That seems to have a future too, as far as I can tell. But that whole layer, of newspapers that were 15 years ago, 20 years ago, every day were this thick, it just seemed to be vanishing.
Absolutely. We have another viewer question, this time from Spencer Lee, who says, watching from NYC, 2020 is an exceptional case, but should we get accustomed to races not being called on election night in the future due to an increase in absentee ballots and mail-in voting? New York didn't even open absentee ballots until a week after the election.
Don't get me started on New York. That's just, I don't even know the right word for New York system is the worst in the country. And thank goodness the election did not come down to New York. I mean, we knew that was going to be a blue state. We knew Biden was going to win it. It's embarrassing that New York was that bad at getting these votes counted. I think the answer to this question is we don't have, as far as I'm concerned, we do not have to get used to this. This relates to what I was talking about earlier. What reforms are going to come out of this election? If we're going to have an increase in early voting, if we're going to have a massive increase in mail-in voting, how are we going to handle it? How are individual states going to decide to handle it going forward? I think there's a model out there to make this work. Florida has, I said Florida was doing pandemic style elections before the pandemic. Florida in 2016 had mail-in voting. Florida in 2016 and well before had extensive in-person early voting, along with election day voting, a substantial chunk of election day votes coming in. Florida has managed now for a while to get all of those votes counted, tabulated, reported out by election night generally. In the 2018 midterms, there was lag in Broward County. One county in Florida had a lag, a giant one where Fort Lauderdale is. One county had a lag in 2018. Everything else was reported out that night. In 2020, it was all out. We knew Trump had won Florida, I'm going to say by 10:45 on election night. Don't hold me to that number. I can't think too clearly at trying to piece that night back together. But we knew that night that Trump had won Florida. It all got reported out. Florida, I believe, look, they were the site of one of the biggest modern election disasters 20 years ago in that Bush-Gore election. But since then, I think Florida's become a model. And if a state as big and diverse and expansive as Florida can get giant, numbers of mail-in ballots, giant numbers of in-person early votes, and giant numbers of same-day votes, all counted out and reported out on election night, I don't think any other state has an excuse.
A viewer asked, and I think it's a good question maybe for us to end on, Steve, what about Trump in 2021, 22, and so forth? What do you expect, and what do you think the media's approach to covering him ought to be? Much discussed topic in media circles these days.
Yeah, my answer to that is I think the answer has to do with how I believe the Republican Party treats him. Do they treat him like he is still their leader? Do they take their cues from him? For example, let's say there is a pending deal, or there seems to be a deal between Joe Biden and, let's say, the Republicans still have the Senate. We'll see what happens in Georgia, but let's say the Republicans still have the Senate, and Biden and McConnell seem to have a deal on a major piece of legislation, and Trump decides he doesn't like the deal and he wants to blow the deal up. The Republicans take their cues from him. Does he succeed in blowing the deal up? Does he succeed in getting Republicans who were just about to sign off on it to say, oh no, I can't do that? That's the dynamic we've seen certainly for the last 4 years with his presidency. We've seen Republicans on Capitol Hill taking their cues from him. Do they continue to do that when he's not president? I think that's a story. I think the question of whether that's going to be the case is a major story in these first few months of 2021, because this is going to be, I think Trump is certainly positioned to be a former president like we haven't seen in modern times, just in terms of his visibility, his desire to weigh in on probably everything. He's certainly given us every indication that'll be the case. And so I think my question is, and I think the story in those early months is, how does the Republican Party deal with that? And I think if the answer is, he emerges as sort of still the de facto leader of the Republican Party, it seems to me, hard not to cover that.
Fair enough, Steve. I'd like to close tonight with a couple of quick thoughts, end of year thoughts. And Steve, if you'll bear with me and the audience will bear with me, stick around for a minute. The next edition of the News Project Live will be next year. And I know we all share the hope for better times in 2021 and can't put 2020 behind us fast enough. Among the many things we hope for is an environment in which our leaders and the public have a renewed respect for a free press. The news media won't be called the enemy of the people any longer from the White House, but it's worth recalling that those in the Obama-Biden administration were not great friends of a free press either, or of open government and transparency. Hopefully, recent lessons about the importance of a free press and an aggressive press will resonate over the next 4 years. Since support for a free press at a time when the model is so fragile is so important, consider your support for news organizations in the holiday season. Take on an additional subscription for a news organization or become a member of a great news site or of a fledgling local news organization. Send gifts of subscriptions or memberships to friends and family. Support the news. And for those of you who work at NGOs or entrepreneurs, be in touch with those of us who are trying to help new news sites get developed. It's an important thing for our communities and for our civic lives. And finally, relish the holidays. Please Zoom and FaceTime like crazy with friends and family. But unless you're in a position to test and quarantine, don't travel. Please stay home. The holidays next fall will be even sweeter when flying, having road trips, large family gatherings, and office parties, and all of that will relish even more. And consider support, please, for those in your communities who will be struggling this winter. Drop food off or contribute to food banks. We have a virus pandemic and a food shortage epidemic all around us. Thanks to all of you for tuning into this episode and all these episodes. Thanks, Steve, for spending an evening with us. We really appreciate. We appreciate your work as well. See you and everyone else next year. Alex, happy holidays. Good night.
Happy holidays.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.